So, good evening and welcome to this evening's Darwin College lecture. The fall of empire is a fearful matter. Can one foresee the overthrow of a great and ancient society? This is proper meat for us in Cambridge. At the height of the British power, our very own mad, bad and dangerous to know Trinity College product, Lord Byron, wrote on the fall of Sardanapalus, the legendary last king of Assyria, and to quote Byron, he said, "He sweats in palling pleasures, dulls his soul, and saps his goodly strength." Besieged in his palace, orgies and corruption were the norm for the king, until he met a spectacular death as his flaming palace crumbled into the Euphrates. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. The great long-lived Assyrian Empire finally fell, and her ally Egypt, the other superpower of that period, also departed the world stage. The Babylonians were victorious, though not for long, and the book of Daniel tells that tale. As King Belshazzar feasted and drank from holy vessels taken from the temple in Jerusalem, writing appeared on his palace wall. "Thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians." And Babylon fell. All empires fall. But from Assyria to the Soviet Union, I can only think of one great empire in all history with the foresight not to fall by catastrophic conquest, or at least revolt, dissension, and slaughter. Eating, drinking, merrymaking, not with Gandhi or Attlee around. I don't know if Attlee knew Byron's Sardanapalus, but I expect he did. Instead of catastrophe, we here inherit the Commonwealth, physically so weak as to be almost invisible, but a cultural superpower. Mandela, Tutu, Aung San Suu Kyi, and who knows how many Nobel Prizes in literature. Foresight does help. Now, tonight, it gives me very great pleasure to welcome Professor Francesca Rochberg from the Near Eastern Studies at the University of California in Berkeley. She's been a Guggenheim Fellow, a visiting fellow at Magdalen College, Oxford, and a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And fallen empires are her speciality. She's also your expert should you need to write a letter to someone who only reads Sumerian or Akkadian. I don't know how many of those there are around. She's written extensively on the extraordinary Babylonian knowledge of astronomy and astrology, the basis of so much science that came later. Those great Babylonian efforts were all about foresight, the magi of the Epiphany. Professor Rochberg.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Fowler, for that wonderful introduction. Can everyone hear me all right? Yes, okay. It is simply an honor to be here. I want to thank Professor Fowler as well for hosting me in the beautiful Darwin College. And I also want to thank the former master, Professor William Brown, for the invitation to speak here today. And as well, Professor Lawrence Sherman, for the friendly phone call that started the whole ball rolling. Mostly, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be here and a privilege to be able to round off this 28th annual Darwin College lecture series. Assyria's place among ancient states of the Near East has been secured for modern historians by its imperial achievement. From the 8th to the end of the 7th centuries BC, Assyria organized under one rule an area encompassing southwestern Iran to southeastern Turkey. It engulfed the Levant, Egypt, and Babylonia, gaining access to the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean Sea, and the rich trade routes through the Zagros Mountains east to Afghanistan and north into Urartu, or modern-day Armenia. As the first and architect of all later empires, Assyria is known principally from the many monuments to its own sovereignty and power that survive in the form of exquisite inscribed stone bas-relief representations of the exploits of war, conquest, and cruelty to its enemies. This drawing shows the king, heroic, drawing his bow as he led the siege on his chariot, like the onset of a raging storm, as Sennacherib's annals put it. One of the most famous Assyrian sieges is that of Sennacherib at Lachish in ancient Judah, shown here from the reliefs at the Nineveh palace of that king. In the next panel, we see preparations for the flaying of rebels at Lachish. And we have verbal testimony to such actions from the annals of Ashurnasirpal II, describing his treatment of rebels in the taking of the city Suru in northern Mesopotamia. He said, "I erected a pile in front of his gate. I flayed as many nobles as had rebelled against me, and draped their skins over the pile. Some I spread out within the pile. Some I erected on stakes upon the pile, and some I placed on stakes around the pile." These images, both visual and verbal, uncovered from the splendid palaces at Nineveh, as we see reconstructed in these modern drawings. These images, the ancient images, coupled with vivid accounts in the Bible, where Assyria was reviled by the prophet Isaiah, give us something of the face Assyria presented to the outside world. A more behind-the-scenes look at the internal workings of this first of all empires, however, takes us directly to the subject of the present lecture series, to the systematic, institutional implementation of foresight, in this case for the achievement, management, and maximization of the future power and security of the state of Assyria. A passage from a 7th century BC diviner's guide recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal in the Assyrian capital of Nineveh contains the following question. When you know the sign and they ask you to save the city, the king and his population from the hands of the enemy, from pestilence, from famine, what will you say? They will say to you, how will you make the evil consequences of omens pass by? The diviners of the royal court, well-trained literati, expert in the identification and interpretation of ominous signs, forecast the future on behalf of, as the text says, the city, the king, and his population. According to letters from these diviners, preserved from the reigns of the last two great Assyrian monarchs, Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, important decisions concerning military, cultic, and personal matters were gauged in accordance with forecasts from ominous signs. Ever since the mid-19th century decipherment of cuneiform, the wedge writing for which Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and the Achaemenid Persians are now famed, modern Assyriologists have worked to reconstruct the history of the Assyrian Empire. Our modern reconstruction focuses on its formation, exploitation of conquered territories, and final fall. This history has been reconstructed from excavated artifacts and images testifying to the geographical extent of Assyrian influence, and from data extracted from extant Assyrian accounts of wars, rebellions, and conquest. But the story of the Assyrian Empire, the one that the Assyrians told themselves, their descendants, and the gods, is one of quite different focus and emplotment. This internal version, or master narrative, is the story that underpins the annalistic inscriptions of Assyrian kings. It gives the reportage of campaigns, sieges, and victories over rebels a framework, revealing the importance of foresight as a central strategy for the conduct of imperial business. That narrative, not unlike what we see in the biblical histories, featured the gods as historical actors and focused on the intimate relationship between the king and his gods. In the Assyrian understanding of both the historical past and the imagined future of the empire, the gods figured as prominently as did the king's own royal ancestors and descendants. As represented in this stela of Ashurnasirpal II, found at Nimrud, or ancient Kalhu, the king gestures reverently toward the symbols of the Assyrian national god Ashur and the astral gods, Shamash, the sun, Sin, the moon, and Ishtar, the planet Venus. The annalistic royal inscriptions telling of the achievements of the Assyrian kings are as though reports directed to these gods, proving the dedication of the king in carrying out the divine will for him to rule, to expand his lands and amass wealth with which to adorn temples and divine statues. Most important in the present context, the means used by the crown to make significant decisions were divinatory techniques designed to gather knowledge of the future by communication with the gods. Modern scholars have mined Assyrian royal inscriptions for historical information, but the purpose of those inscriptions and of many other sources that shed light on Assyrian political and military action was not to render a historical account of events, but to legitimate the imperial agenda and project its security into the future by claims to divine approval. Today, the institutional variety of foresight is associated with various collectives, corporations, or polities, entities that need to make informed decisions about the future, specifically about how they might see their own success maximized in the future. Scenarios and narratives, visions and alternatives are part of the terminology of institutional foresight. As we try to understand the perspective from inside the Assyrian royal court, itself a complex collective entity spearheaded by the reigning monarch, these concepts are not entirely unrelated. Of course, the premise on which foresight was institutionalized in Assyria stemmed from a worldview and a metaphysics that do not translate into those of Western modernity. The impulse to project an image of the future into which it could see its own growth and success, however, is certainly kindred. And for this to happen, the Assyrian king needed a large complement of experts in techniques of divination. As an aside, perhaps I should not presume such a radical difference between ancients and moderns. After all, an American president from the 1980s, or his wife anyway, similarly employed, well, an expert in astrology as a matter of strategic foresight, but perhaps testifying precisely to this divide between ancient and modern metaphysics and worldview, the White House astrologer was kept secret until she was outed the year prior to that president's last year in office. Turning back to the 7th century BC, celestial diviners and haruspices, who inspected the liver of a sacrificed sheep, each made forecasts of political and economic events on behalf of the king. These diviners constituted an elite among scribes in the employ of the Assyrian kings. They made reports in writing to the king, who took the results of their liver inspection or celestial observation into account before undertaking many activities. It was not enough to know the signs and make forecasts from them, or even to predict, in the case of celestial signs, the very phenomena whose appearances were ominous. It was also necessary, as indicated in the passage from the Diviner's Handbook just quoted, for the scribal specialist to make the evil pass by. Foresight in ancient Assyria, therefore, not only involved forecasting and prediction, but also forestalling by apotropaic magic, that is, magic that wards off evil. Then, as now, foresight is not simply looking forward, but anticipating future change and acting on that vision. Fundamental and essential to the system within which foresight was institutionalized by the Assyrian state was the idea that certain divinities communicated their knowledge of the future indeed their will concerning the future, by producing the phenomena of the world, both on earth and in the sky, to function as indicators of future events. This all-important feature of foresight in cuneiform culture is the distant cousin to our own somewhat archaic English usage, meaning providence or divine foresight. Contrary to Western assumptions about the inevitability of divine providence, sometimes associated with the natural order of the world itself, ancient Near Eastern gods were amenable to prayer and ritual appeasement, as evidenced in the many extant prayers and apotropaic rituals against evil portents from such things as the appearance of animals, snakes, malformed births, and lunar eclipses. Our same Diviner's Handbook instructs that when you look up a sign in the Omen collection, be it one in the sky or one on earth, and if that sign's evil portent is confirmed in reference to an enemy or to a disease or to a famine, check the date of that sign, and should no sign have occurred to counteract that sign, should no annulment have taken place, one cannot make it pass by. Its evil cannot be removed. It will happen. It is clear from this passage that the apotropaic effects of magic were thought to be efficacious in counteracting signs and removing the evil they portended. If no such steps were taken, the sign's portended consequences were then considered inevitable. This, however, is no fatalism. The Assyrians lived in a world of future contingencies, not of immutable determinism. Their gods knew the future, but the nature of divine foreknowledge was of a different order from that of the later Christian God, about whose foreknowledge and predetermination of all things medieval theologians and scholastics had difficulty reconciling with the question of free will. This was not an Assyrian problem. Foresight and fatalism do not sit well together, and the ancient Assyrian diviners were not hampered by notions of the fixity of nature or the chain of physical causality. Nonetheless, an omen functioned as an indicator of future events, not as a one-time or random occurrence put there by the gods ad hoc to signal particular events in the sense of this battle or that disease, as conditional statements in the form, if P, then Q. Phenomena were indicators of events in a general, even abstract, and regularly recurring way. Eclipses of a certain description portended plague or the death of a monarch. The appearance of a star inside the halo of the moon signaled that the king and his troops would be surrounded and besieged, and so on, with omens for thousands of phenomena. Celestial phenomena and their portended events did not, however, stand in relation to one another as cause to effect. Rather, they stood as meaningful correlations, often construed by the use of analogy, as in the example of the star in the lunar halo indicating that the king's army will be under siege. Ancient Mesopotamian omens reflect neither post hoc ergo propter hoc, that is after this, therefore because of this, fallacious reasoning, nor a system of mechanical causality. They operated on the basis of association and analogy, or by other kinds of connections inscrutable to our way of thinking. The foregoing description of omens as correlations or associations is very much a modern translation of how Assyro-Babylonian omens functioned to indicate the future. To the literati trained in reading and interpreting cuneiform texts, however, omens were a form of writing. Physical phenomena, either the marks and contours of the liver or the various phenomena of the celestial bodies, were, according to the scribe's own description, written messages concerning the future. The gods wrote on the liver, called the tablet of the gods, as seen in this inscribed clay liver model. And they wrote on the sky, where celestial phenomena were called heavenly writing. as you see on this disc-shaped tablet, containing the drawings of some constellations, together with their names and other scribal notations not well understood by modern scholars yet. Even here, the constellations are drawn with similar wedge-formed strokes, and it seems, therefore, that the diviner scribes read the gods' heavens and the liver in much the same manner as they read cuneiform tablets. The divine writing was a compelling metaphor, if indeed it was a metaphor, for the intelligibility of the world both in heaven and on earth. The comprehensible nature of the world as manifested in a divine orthography was just as basic to the Assyrian and Babylonian conception of the world as the later notion of the book of nature became for Western natural philosophy and science. What is important here, however, is not just that physical phenomena were comprehensible, but that their value for gauging future prospects was based upon a premise of regular recurrence. Regular recurrence was not understood to manifest a system of causes, as already indicated, but of regular and recurring associations or meanings. In this way, the future was bound up with the past by the logic of its own internal semantics and orthography. By association, P indicated Q in the past, present, and future. Whenever P was observed, therefore, Q was expected to occur. The connection between the past and the future is undoubtedly a critical node in the logic of foresight. According to Alfred Marcus, who has worked on the principles, models, and methods of foresight in business management, organizations rely on master narratives to structure people's understanding of the past and the future. What narratives or stories do best is lend coherence to what otherwise may be construed as random occurrences or events whose connection is sometimes difficult to see. The future relates to the past by the logic of the narrative. With respect to the future's dependence upon the past, as Marcus put it, understanding what has occurred provides an impetus for what to do next. It supplies reasoning for affirming or rejecting old patterns of behavior and starting new projects that put organizations on novel trajectories. The past is a critical and essential springboard for thinking about the future, unquote. Such is the nature of Mesopotamian omen divination, which in turn informed the internal narrative of the Assyrian Empire. The signs signaled future events because the gods intended that human beings, the king being the exemplary human being, should know the future. Regularity and repetition were built into the system, and in that way, events followed events in a certain readable fashion, lending a logical, predictive structure to omen divination. Even though we might say that omen divination did not predict, but rather indicated possibilities, the practice was implemented for purposes of foresight, which is to say, it facilitated the Assyrian king's desire or need to project himself and his political agenda into the future with the best chance of success. The fact that magical means to avert or annul portents was possible only shows that the final arbiters of all things were the gods. And because the future was imagined as bound to the past through the repetition of signs and portents, action within a world so determined by divine design depended upon the ability of the king, through his diviners, to comprehend, observe, and interpret that design in the repeatable patterns, the language, so to say, of ominous phenomena. Divination from omens was not the invention of the Assyrian Empire, nor did it end with the empire's fall. It was already an age-old practice, beginning in Babylonia during the 2nd millennium BC. A poetic text from this early date is one of the earliest attestations to the use of stars as signs. It is a prayer to the gods of night. The gods, that is, the celestial bodies, include some constellations we can identify, such as Canis Major, called Boötes, called yoke, of a plow, that is. and Orion, called the true shepherd of Anu. Here, in a somewhat different orientation, is the same circular disk as we saw just before, except the names and words have been omitted. Orion, as imagined by the Babylonians and Assyrians, can be seen here in sector 4, here. And even we can recognize readily what we call the asterism of the belt of Orion, the 3 bright stars. Among the gods of night, but unfortunately not depicted on this celestial disk, were also Ursa Major, called the wagon, and Lyra, the she-goat. Already at the time of the prayer to the gods of night, in the period of Hammurabi of Babylon in the 18th century BC, celestial phenomena were compiled into lists of ominous signs, focusing in that early period on the moon, particularly on the lunar eclipse. Unlike with the stars, or moon, where the celestial gods gave signs by their very appearances, extispicy, or the reading of the omens in the sheep's exta, the liver principally, required that an offering and a formal petition first be made to the patron gods Shamash and Adad before the liver was inspected. In this context, the gods were conceived of and explicitly addressed as divine judges. As the diviner prepared to go before the gods, Shamash and Adad, he would say, "I am cleansed now. To the assembly of the gods I draw near for judgment. O Shamash, Lord of judgment, O Adad, Lord of prayers and acts of divinatory inspection, in the ritual I perform, in the extispicy I perform, place the truth." The events portended by omens from the liver, as well as from the heavens, applied to the king, the country, and the populace at large, covering all manner of military and economic disasters, the rising of floodwaters to destroy crops, plagues of locusts, or disease among the herds or the population as a whole. These phenomena were systematically arranged in lengthy lists, some that explicitly echo the diviner's guidebook in his reference to the city, the king, and his people. An omen from the celestial omen list, entitled Enuma Anu Enlil, concerns a solar eclipse occurring on the 30th day of the month Ululu, as you see on the slide. It says, "If on the 30th day there is a solar eclipse, the city, king, and his people will be well, but lions will become wild and block passage on the road." Or, "If on the 18th day there is a solar eclipse, the city, king, and his people will have peace, but plague will destroy the herds." Another tablet of Enuma Anu Enlil contains relatively detailed descriptions of lunar eclipse phenomena with portents for the various enemies of Babylonia, the point of view from which the omens were originally constructed. One such example reads, "If an eclipse occurs on the 14th day of Tebetu, and the god, that is the moon, in his eclipse becomes dark on the east upper part of the disk and clears on the west lower part, the west wind rises and the eclipse begins in the last watch and does not end with the watch. His cusps are the same, neither one nor the other is wider or narrower. You should observe his eclipse, that is, of the moon in whose eclipse the cusps were the same, neither one being wider or narrower, and bear in mind the west wind. The verdict applies to Subartu. Brother will smite brother, the people will suffer defeat. There will be many widows. The king of Subartu will make peace with the lands. Thus is its sign and its verdict." This passage instructs the diviner just how to interpret the lunar eclipse in question, that is, as pertaining to the region of Subartu in northern Mesopotamia, the region that would ultimately become Assyria. What is referred to as the verdict refers to the social consequences of this eclipse, as though rendered by the gods as judges in a case, and evokes the same conception of the gods as judges that we heard in the prayer to be said before reading the omens in the liver. Celestial omens from Enuma Anu Enlil appear in the correspondence between diviners and the kings Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, as mentioned before. As in the following passage from one such letter from an unknown scholar, the correspondence affords us a glimpse of how the experts interpreted celestial signs and explained them to the king. The writer first quotes an omen. If Mars appears in the month Ayaru, there will be hostilities, affliction of the Umanmanda. He then explains, Umanmanda means the Cimmerians. And here we see the area he refers to. And he refers here to a people of unclear origins, but found in Anatolia, south of the Black Sea. He continues, the solar eclipse, which occurred in the month Nisanu, did not afflict the region of the Northland. Also, the planet Jupiter retained its position, meaning presumably it was at one of its stationary points. It was present for 15 days. That is propitious. And again, he quotes an omen. If the sun rises amidst a resplendent cloud bank, the king will become angry and raise his weapons. And then he explains, as regards the rains which were so scanty this year that no harvest was reaped, this is a good omen pertaining to the life and vigor of the king, my lord. The parallelism between Mesopotamian liver and astral divination underscores the fact that the signs in heaven were not causes of future happenings, nor did they affect the future by stellar influence, as we generally assume to be the case in astrology. Instead, looking to the future in ancient Assyria depended upon knowledge of a pattern of events in the past. Regular recurrence was part of the god's design or scheme of things. That the Assyrians saw the future in perpetual negotiation with the past is demonstrable precisely by the evidence for divination, and it is a critical element in the Assyrian view of the world as a whole. All things held together as part of a divine design, whether temporally in the connection between past and future, or spatially in the unity of the imperial lands seen on this map, and at least in principle, the coextension of the empire with the entire inhabited world. This divine design, in Akkadian literally drawings or plans, was instantiated in the ominous signs. Let us look now in more detail at the implementation of institutional foresight during the reign of Esarhaddon from 681 to 669 BC. He is depicted here on a victory stela in the attitude of reverence to the gods. And according to the master narrative, he tells of his own appointment as crown prince by divine selection. He relates how his father, Sennacherib, questioned the gods Shamash and Adad by divination, and they answered him with a firm yes, saying, he is your replacement. But Esarhaddon's succession was troubled as he faced the subterfuge of his own brothers and would-be usurpers. He tells of his prayers to the gods Ashur, Sin, Shamash, Baal, Nabu, and Nergal, Ishtar of Nineveh and Ishtar of Arbela, who, as he said, accepted my words. With their firm yes, they were sending me reliable omens, saying, go, do not hold back. We will go and kill your enemies. And when in fact he claimed his throne and entered Nineveh, he said, the south wind, the breeze of the god Ea, the wind whose blowing is favorable for exercising kingship, blew upon me. Favorable signs came in good time to me in heaven and on earth. These inscriptions establish Esarhaddon's succession as the result of divine selection, confirmed by divine favor, indicated by signs in heaven and on earth. Indeed, the announcement of the omens was an essential ingredient of the master narrative, the key to securing a legitimate claim. One of the first of Esarhaddon's acts as king was his entry into Babylon to establish his kingship there. No Assyrian overlordship of Babylonia could be successful without formal acceptance and approval of the king by the Babylonian national god Marduk. In order to achieve this, Esarhaddon would have to restore Marduk's temple, the Esagil, which had been destroyed when Sennacherib, Esarhaddon's father, mounted a vicious campaign against Babylonia and their Elamite allies. After smashing the divine statues in the temples of Babylon and seizing their property, Sennacherib described his final destruction of the city. He said, "The city and its temples, from its foundation to its walls, I destroyed, I devastated, I burned with fire. The inner wall and outer wall, temples and gods, the ziggurat of brick and earth, as many as there were, I razed and dumped them into the Arachtu Canal. Through the midst of that city, I dug canals. I flooded its ground with water, and the very foundations thereof I destroyed. I made its destruction more complete than that by a flood, that in days to come, the site of that city and its temples and gods might not be remembered. I completely blotted it out with floods of water and made it like a meadow." When in 681 Esarhaddon became king and set out to establish his own sovereignty over the beleaguered Babylonia, he declared that the astral manifestation of the Babylonian god Marduk, that is the planet Jupiter, sent him a positive omen. He said, "At the beginning of my kingship, in my first year, good signs were established for me in heaven and on earth concerning the refurbishing of the gods and the rebuilding of shrines. Jupiter shone brightly and came near in the 3rd month and stood in his place where the sun shines. He reached the place of secret, where he was at his most propitious, for a 2nd time in the 7th month, and stayed in his place." Again, Jupiter was stationary. Without the celestial omen from the Babylonian god Marduk, Esarhaddon's reopening and re-entry into the temple Esagil as king of Babylonia would have been impossible to sell. He was, however, not deterred because, as the annals continue, in order to triumph and to show overpowering strength, he, the god Marduk, revealed to me good omens concerning the re-entering of Esagil. The stars of heaven stood in their positions and took the correct, literally the true path, and left the incorrect, literally the untrue path. Another of the annals reiterates and expands upon this astral communication of divine approval thus: "In order to give the land and the people verdicts of truth and justice, the gods Sin and Shamash, the twin gods, moon and sun, took the road of truth and justice monthly. They made their appearance regularly, and Venus, the brightest of the stars, was seen in the west in the path of the Ea stars. Concerning the securing of the land and the reconciliation of its gods, it, meaning Venus, reached the position where it was at its most propitious and then disappeared. Mars, the giver of decisions on the land Amurru, meaning to the west of Assyria, shone brightly in the path of the Ea stars, and it revealed its sign concerning the strengthening of the ruler and his land." For Esarhaddon to have advanced into Babylonia without knowing the favorable assent of the gods delivered through ominous signs in heaven would have been an arrogant sacrilege. Indeed, the topos of the king fallen from grace for ignoring omens was known in Esarhaddon's time. It was perhaps best exemplified in the figure of Naram-Sin, the Akkadian ruler from the 3rd millennium BC, who bore on his head responsibility for the destruction of his own empire because of his neglect of divine signs. The legend of Naram-Sin was part of the holdings of the Assyrian royal tablet collection at Nineveh during Esarhaddon's reign. Similarly, for other acts of political gain, records of the appeal to the sun god Shamash show that nothing of any real consequence would be undertaken without first ascertaining knowledge of its outcome by divination. In the text of one such query to the sun god, Esarhaddon's plans for a campaign to the north of Assyria are set before the god to be followed by an extispicy. The query reads, Shamash, great Lord, give me a firm positive answer to what I am asking you. From this day, the 22nd day of this month, to the 21st day of next month, for 30 days and nights, which is the stipulated term for the performance of this extispicy, will the troops of the Scythians, which have been staying in the district of Mania to the north of Assyria, and are now moving out from the territory of Mania, will they strive and plan? Will they move out and go through the passes of Hubushkia to the city Harania and the city Anisus? Will they take much plunder and booty from the territory of Assyria? Does your great divinity know it? In addition to making such queries to the sun god to be followed by a liver divination, the celestial diviners were also consulted on similar situations. Here is a letter from a celestial diviner, one Baal Ushezib, to King Esarhaddon concerning the invasion of the same Manian territory cited in the extispicy query we just heard. These Manians evidently came into the region north of Assyria around Lake Ormia, here, and were occupying an area not far from the ambit of the Cimmerians that we heard about before. The letter says, to the king of the lands, my lord, your servant Baal Ushezib, may Baal, Nabu, and Shamash bless the king, my lord. Immediately, Baal Ushezib quotes an omen. If a star flashes like a torch from the east and disappears in the east, the main army of the enemy will fall. Then he begins to advise. If the king has written to his army saying, invade Mania, the whole army should not invade. Only the cavalry and the professional troops should invade. In a subsequent letter, Baal Ushezib reported on the fall of Mania to Esarhaddon's army. He said, I saw the crescent of the moon, but the sun was rising. Whether it was a crescent, or whether it appeared on the 15th, or whether it will appear on the 16th, it is an evil portent, and it concerns the Manians. Wherever an enemy attacks a country, the country will carry this evil portent. Now the army of the king, my lord, having attacked the Manians, has captured forts, plundered towns, and pillaged the open country. Indeed, in a later version of the Annals, composed 3 years before the end of Esarhaddon's reign, he called himself the one who scattered the Manian people. The most ambitious long-distance military operation conducted in the expansion of Esarhaddon's empire was his invasion of Egypt and subjugation of the 25th dynasty under the Kushite king Taharka. Here depicted as a sphinx in a monument from the Sudan, the heartland of ancient Kush, his homeland. This ruler is also known to us as Tirhakah from the Bible. In a well-known episode in the second book of Kings, Tirhakah is the ally of Hezekiah, king of Judah. Esarhaddon's father, Sennacherib, had mocked the Judahite king for, quote, relying on Egypt, that broken reed of a staff, which will pierce the hand of any man who leans on it. Such is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who rely on him. In this instance, according to the biblical writers and Lord Byron, things ended badly for Assyria. To borrow a bit from Byron, the Assyrian may have come down like a wolf on the fold, but the angel of the god Yahweh slaughtered 185,000 Assyrians that night and left the widows of Ashur loud in their wail. The defeated Sennacherib went home to Nineveh, where he was promptly killed by 2 of his sons, and Esarhaddon succeeded the throne. On the other hand, Taharka remained pharaoh long enough to later become, once again, the target of Assyria's expansion into Egypt under Esarhaddon. But before Esarhaddon set out on his Egyptian expedition, he made an extispicy query as follows. Shamash, great lord, give me a firm, positive answer to what I am asking you. Should Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, strive and plan? Should he take the road with his army and camp and go to the district of Egypt as he wishes? Should he wage war against Taharka, king of Cush, and his army? In waging this war, will the weapons of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, and his army prevail over the weapons of Taharka, king of Cush, and the troops which he has? Will Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, return alive and set foot on Assyrian soil? Does your great divinity know it? Be present in this ram. Place in it a firm, positive answer. Favorable designs, favorable, propitious omens by the oracular command of your great divinity, and may I see them. May this query go to your great divinity, O Shamash, and may an oracle be given as an answer. We can only imagine that Shamash did write a favorable answer in that liver, because Esarhaddon erected a victory stela in 671 to commemorate his destruction of Memphis. This stela, found at Zincirli in southern Turkey, shows the young son and crown prince of Taharka, Ush-Ankuru, the smaller of the two figures, in bondage on the lower right. The inscribed portion of the stela relates that after the god Ashur and the great gods, my lords, had ordered me to march far along remote roads, through rugged mountains and great sand dunes, where one is always thirsty, I marched safely and in good spirits. As for Taharka, the king of Egypt and Cush, the accursed of their great divinity, from the city Ishupri to Memphis, his royal city, a march of 15 days overland, I inflicted serious defeats on him daily without ceasing. Moreover, by means of arrows, I inflicted him 5 times with wounds from which there is no recovery. And as for the city of Memphis, his royal city, within half a day and by means of mines, breaches, and ladders, I besieged it, conquered it, demolished it, destroyed it, and burned it with fire. The opening statement of the stela is further testimony to the god's power to decree the future by sending signs and making judgments concerning the king and his political aspirations. It reads, "The god Ashur, father of the gods, who loves my priestly service, the god Anu, the powerful, the foremost, the one who called my name, the god Enlil, lofty lord, the one who confirmed my reign, the god Ea, wise one, knowing one, who decrees my destiny, the god Sin, shining Nanar, the one who makes signs favorable for me, the god Shamash, judge of heaven and netherworld, the one who provides verdicts for me, the god Adad, terrifying lord, the one who makes my troops prosper, the god Marduk, hero of the Igigu and Anunnaki gods, the one who makes my kingship great, the goddess Ishtar, lady of war and battle, who goes at my side, the Sabiti, valiant gods, the ones who overthrow my enemies, the great gods, all of them, who decree destiny and give victorious might to the king, their favorite." Reference to the gods in the opening lines of the stela was surely to restate before them the piety of the king. But the pietistic accounts of political and military triumph that we have heard illustrated in the several quotations from royal annals are consistent with the other texts I've been quoting that reflect pragmatic, behind-the-scenes operations, such as the extispicy queries to the sun god and the letters from scholar scribes concerning celestial omens. These texts confirm for us that hymn-like rhapsodizing about the gods in annalistic texts was not merely a royal rhetorical flourish, but part of the structure of the master narrative in which the gods were in charge of the future and could be called upon to let their decisions be known. Knowing what the gods had in store through omen divination was then the basis for action and for ensuring the security and growth of the state and of royal power. Those in power have perhaps the most to gain through a judicious use of foresight. It is therefore not surprising that the written remains of one of the most powerful, indeed the first of ancient empires, trained and employed teams of experts in the art and science of looking forward. The literati of ancient Assyria, the scribes and scholars of royal courts and chancelleries, developed an elaborate practice of foresight, analyzing, synthesizing, and interpreting the phenomena around them in accordance with a system of reading the divine language of signs. The practice was both a tool for royal legitimation as well as to enable the king to make pragmatic decisions as to how to project his goals into the future. Ancient Assyrian kings were invested in the art of anticipating the future in the realms of politics and economics, much as we ourselves are invested in projecting and preparing for the future in our modern realms of business, government, and science. They conducted business with an eye on the omens, as we have seen from privileged glimpses within palace chambers through the correspondence between these kings and their advisors. In the tablets produced by the scholars, ranging from handbooks containing lists of ominous signs, celestial and terrestrial, to divinatory prayers, queries, and rituals addressed to the patron gods of divination, in all these numerous and diverse texts, we gain insight into the context, practice, and purpose of Assyro-Babylonian divination and its role in the earliest and most fully documented cultivation of foresight. They tell of the investment in the future survival, continuity, and security of the Assyrian state to its fullest extent as predicated on correct behavior toward the gods and in diligent reading of the gods' written messages concerning the future. Essential to correct behavior toward the gods was the building and maintenance of temples. Indeed, the annals consist both of reports on military expeditions and on the building or restoration of temples. Each of these activities was equally geared to future security. In no uncertain terms, Esarhaddon stated this when he said, in reference to his restoration of the Ashara temple, the temple of Ashur, the national god of Assyria, in the religious capital of Ashur, he said, "I built it for my life, for the prolongation of my days, for the securing of my reign, the well-being of my seed, the safeguarding of the throne of my priestly office. I built it for the overthrowing of my enemies, the prospering of the harvest of Assyria, and for the well-being of Assyria." And in the closing of his account of the restoration of another temple, that of the goddess Queen of Nippur, where he warned any and all who would destroy his work or his words, the focus on the future could not be more clear. He said, "If at any time in the future, during the days of the reign of some future ruler, this temple falls into disrepair and becomes dilapidated, may that ruler seek out its original emplacement and repair its dilapidated parts. The gods will then hear his prayers. He will lengthen his days and enlarge his family. But as for the one who by some crafty device destroys an inscription written in my name or changes its position, may the goddess Queen of Nippur, great lady, glare at him angrily and make his name and his descendants disappear from every land." Because we need to read the Assyrian royal annals for details of history and to reconstruct the empire's rise and fall, we focus less on the internal imperial narrative of the corpus, which concerned itself more with the divine selection and legitimation of Assyrian kings, as well as with proving in the sight of the gods the king's maintenance of the proper relationship between divine and king, thus ensuring the future continuation of the Assyrian state. The Assyrian imperial narrative found a way to tie past, present, and future together into a complex of ideas with real consequences in action, providing a framework within which the Assyrian royal annals, as well as the documentation of contemporaneous letters, omens, oracle queries, and extispicy reports all fit together, that master narrative comprehended a future for which specific divinatory techniques were the mainstay of institutional foresight. As a final and brief coda, I want to say that neither these livers nor celestial portents would have had any contemporary significance apart from the framework provided by the Assyrian imperial narrative, geared as it was to the future and to the survival and success of Assyria. And this is one of the great puzzles of the cuneiform scholastic tradition, namely that we do not know what the purpose of liver or celestial divination was after the fall of Assyria, for by then we have no more access to how those kinds of divination related to a world of political or social reality. Without the continuation of royal correspondence, annals of the deeds of kings, or the queries and reports to the gods, the cuneiform Omen texts, which were preserved for many centuries into the Neo-Babylonian, Persian, and Hellenistic periods of Mesopotamian history, take on the character of a frozen remnant of foresight planning without an anchor in the real world. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much indeed for a very fascinating account of foresight in the Assyrian world and the way that the kings used and recorded plans and predictions. Those brutal treatment of rebels most certainly made it very clear to all that this was not a society to be meddled with. I recall Lord Byron's words on the destruction of Jerusalem by Sennacherib. The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea. They were to be feared. I mean, we need foresight just as the Assyrians did. But fortunately, perhaps we don't use sheep's livers, nor normally astrology. However, we can be too sort of naive in our dependence on IT, the main, thing that we use these days. The computer says, so of course it must be right, mustn't it? And I'm left wondering how our foresight will be viewed and studied and remembered or interpreted by future historians. Will we be regarded as being wise or not? Professor Rochberg, thank you very much indeed for coming from California to speak to us tonight and for ending this 2013 Darwin College Lecture Series really so magnificently. Thank you. Right, this has been a splendid series. Obviously, we started with Geoffrey Lloyd's lecture on foresight in ancient civilizations, and then we've weaved a way through journalism, fiction, and music via the scientific method and the amazing imagery of space weather to human self-control, and then finally back, almost full circle, to the ancient world with tonight's lecture. If you missed any, or you just want to watch a lecture again, don't forget you can see them, any of them, online. Just follow the links on the Darwin College webpage. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to once again thank all the speakers, and then especially to congratulate Geoffrey Lloyd, who many of you may know has been awarded the 2013 Dan David Prize, which is widely regarded as the Nobel Prize of the Humanities. So well done to him. And almost the last thing I need to do at the end of this 28th lecture series is to announce the topic for the 2014 Darwin College Lecture Series. It will be plagues. So I can also announce a draft schedule of speakers and topics. Well, that's very sedate. So we will leave that up for a while so you can all look at it. To say that I'm looking forward to plagues doesn't really sound quite right, does it? But I certainly am looking forward to learning about the ways in which plagues operate and affect us and our societies and how we record and deal with them. So, on behalf of all the organisers for this lecture series, I'd just like to thank all of you for making these lectures such an enjoyable part of Friday evenings in Cambridge, and I look forward to seeing an audience again next year in January 2014 for, we think, plagues and medicine. Thank you.